The security sweep was routine, just verifying credentials across the coalition's central government, until it flagged a human, then another, then a pattern that made the security chief stop breathing. Humans weren't just in the coalition government. They'd been there for 300 years, not as leaders, as clerks, archivists, junior advisors, the quiet, invisible people who write the reports the leaders read, who file the laws, who remember what everyone else forgets. Humanity hadn't infiltrated the government. Humanity had quietly become the parts of it that actually run, and had been gently steering the entire galaxy since the day of first contact. This wasn't a breach of security. It was a revelation of design. 300 years ago, when the Coalition welcomed humanity into the galactic fold, we didn't send diplomats. We sent administrators. Now, a routine credential scan has exposed the truth. Every major policy, every treaty, every crisis response has been filtered through a human desk. The central question is no longer how they got in. It's what they've been steering us toward. The Coalition had been the galaxy's governing body for over 800 years. Thousands of species, hundreds of languages, one grand bureaucracy. Its central government on Varaxis Prime housed the records of every star system, every treaty, every law ever passed. And for 300 of those years, every single one of those records had passed through human hands. Security Chief Kale Voss was a Rithian, a species with a reputation for paranoia that was, in this moment, proving entirely justified. His 4 eyes processed data faster than the central server could deliver it. The credential sweep had started with a simple anomaly: a junior filing clerk in the Department of Resource Allocation whose background file didn't align with standard coalition onboarding protocols. Nothing alarming, clerical error. But Voss had ordered a full historical cross-check anyway because he'd learned long ago that bureaucracies don't make errors. They make patterns. The pattern began with one name, then 12, then 147,000. Every human who had ever been hired by the Coalition, and there were far more than anyone realized, had been placed in the same kinds of roles. Not leadership, never the visible seats of power. Instead, they filled the positions that the galaxy's ambitious species considered beneath them: data entry specialists, legislative archivists, junior policy analysts, scheduling coordinators, mid-level procurement officers. They were the people who formatted the reports, cataloged the evidence, drafted the summaries, and set the meeting agendas. They were the people who decided what the leaders would see and when they would see it. But here's the thing that stopped Voss's secondary hearts. These humans hadn't just fallen into those roles by chance. The hearing records showed a consistent, quiet funneling. Human candidates applied at precisely the right time, with precisely the right qualifications, for precisely the positions that would give them access to the Coalition's informational infrastructure. And every single one of them, for 3 centuries, had performed their jobs so flawlessly that no one had ever thought to look at them twice. When humanity made first contact, they were recorded as a species with barely a century of spaceflight, no military history of note, and a cultural emphasis on cooperation. The Coalition welcomed them as a minor, harmless addition. 5 years later, the first human exchange program placed a dozen administrators into Coalition offices. By year 50, they numbered in the thousands. By year 200, they had become the invisible skeleton upon which the entire galactic government hung. They didn't make decisions. They made the options from which decisions were chosen. They didn't write law. They wrote the language in which law was written, chose which precedents to cite, and decided which historical examples were most relevant to a given case. Voss pulled the personnel files of the 100 oldest human employees still active. Their service records stretched back generations. Some families had held the same obscure post for more than 12 generations. The father would retire, the son would apply, and the hearing algorithm, guided by the glowing performance review of the predecessor, inevitably selected the next human in line. The coalition hadn't hired 100,000 humans. It had hired a dynasty. And then Voss found the memos. Buried deep in archived committee notes, a recurring phrase appeared in decisions that had shaped the galaxy for centuries, revised per administrator recommendations. Those administrators were always human. The recommendations were always minor, a phrasing change here, a procedural adjustment there. But each one, when mapped across time, revealed a vector, a direction, a slow, patient push toward something. Voss isolated the last 100 years of coalition policy changes and filtered for those that originated from human-dominated departments. The result was a map of influence so comprehensive it looked deliberate. Treaties that favored resource distribution toward a specific galactic sector. Military fleet rotations that gradually thinned defenses in particular regions. Educational funding that shaped entire generations of alien civil servants to think in ways that human philosophy departments had pioneered. None of it was overt enough to trigger anyone's threat response. It was just the way things were done. The chief's mandibles clicked softly in the silence of his office. He understood now. The humans hadn't been hiding. They'd been right there in plain sight, doing the jobs no one else wanted, the jobs that were, in reality, the nervous system of the galaxy's greatest power. And the most terrifying question wasn't what they'd already done. It was what they were still planning. He opened the deepest layer of the security sweep, a root-level audit of internal communications flagged for high-level anomaly detection. And there it was. A single encrypted message, routed through 57 human-operated departments over the course of a single day. It contained just 6 words. The seed is ready. Await the bloom. The sender wasn't a person. It was an office that didn't officially exist, and its creation date was the exact same day that first human delegation had stepped onto coalition soil 300 years ago. Security Chief Kale Voss did not sleep for the next 48 hours. The message, the seed is ready. Await the bloom, was not just a communique. It was a trigger. Buried within the coalition's own archival protocol, there existed a sealed directive tied to that exact phrase, one that had been filed under standard system maintenance 300 years ago and renewed every decade without question by the Oversight Committee on Procedural Continuity. The committee was staffed entirely by humans. It always had been. Voss ran a forensic audit of every decision that committee had ever made. The results rewired his understanding of galactic history. The Oversight Committee on Procedural Continuity was responsible for maintaining the bureaucratic infrastructure of the coalition. The filing systems, the digitization standards, the language localization protocols, the metadata taxonomies that every other department depended on. They decided how information was categorized, how laws were cross-referenced, and which historical precedents were flagged as relevant during legislative review. To the rest of the galaxy, this was janitorial work, invisible, unglamorous, beneath notice. But Voss now understood that whoever controlled the metadata controlled the meaning, and whoever controlled the meaning controlled the law. The seed, he discovered, was not a military weapon. It was a cognitive architecture. Over 3 centuries, the humans had been quietly rewriting the coalition's entire informational framework, layering in subtle biases that no one had ever bothered to audit because no one outside the human administrative network even understood the systems deeply enough to try. The search algorithms that justices used to find precedent, the economic models that trade ministers relied on, the conflict resolution matrices that prevented wars, all of them had been built on human-designed logic trees. And every logic tree contained the same root assumption, that stability, cooperation, and long-term survival were the highest values. It was a philosophy, a benevolent one, but it was undeniably, invisibly human. Voss isolated the moment the bloom was scheduled to occur. According to the sealed directive, the final phase of the cognitive restructuring would trigger automatically when the coalition's population reached a certain threshold of species integration, a point where the number of member worlds whose histories had been fully digitized and cross-referenced exceeded 98% of all known civilizations. That threshold had been crossed 17 days ago. The bloom was already in motion. And its final outcome, according to the directive's own encrypted appendix, was the dissolution of species-based governance in favor of a unified administrative consciousness, a single, harmonized system of planetary management that would render traditional political leadership obsolete. The humans weren't trying to conquer the galaxy. They were trying to make the very concept of conquest irrelevant. But there was a catch. And Voss found it 3 hours later, buried in a subroutine that the main directive didn't reference. The bloom was designed to be irreversible, but only if the original seed remained uncompromised. If any external intelligence discovered and exposed the human cognitive architecture before full integration, the system would default to a catastrophic failsafe, a complete purge of all human-influenced protocols, which would effectively lobotomize the coalition government overnight. Every trade agreement, every treaty, every legal precedent built on the human-designed framework would dissolve into anarchic data corruption. The galaxy would not just lose its government, it would lose its memory. The humans had protected their plan with a dead man's switch. Voss leaned back from his console, his 4 amber eyes wide with a horror that was entirely new to him. He had spent his career hunting threats to the coalition, and now he held in his hands a secret that could destroy it. If he revealed what he knew, the failsafe activated and trillions of lives would be thrown into chaos. If he stayed silent, the bloom completed, and humanity's quiet dream of a unified galaxy would become permanent reality. He was not a politician. He was a security officer. He was trained to neutralize threats, but this threat had been a gift. A careful, patient, 300-year-old gift. His console chimed. A new message, unencrypted, rooted from an address that resolved to the non-existent office. It read, "Chief Voss, we anticipated your discovery approximately 112 years ago. The window for forced exposure is now closed. The bloom is self-sustaining. We do not wish to harm the coalition. We wish to save it from itself. You are invited to observe the final integration. Please respond with your intent or simply continue reading. Either way, you are already part of the architecture." Voss realized with a cold certainty that his own security clearance, his own position, his own chain of promotions, all of it had been cultivated by the very humans he was investigating. He had been chosen for this moment. The question was no longer whether the humans were steering the galaxy. The question was whether he was willing to help them finish. Kale Voss did not respond to the message. Instead, he did what his species had evolved to do. He dug deeper. The human architecture had anticipated him, but only within the parameters it had modeled. Voss knew one truth that the humans had never fully accounted for. Paranoia, when you feed it enough data, becomes prediction. And he had just found the data that no one, not the humans, not the oversight committee, not the architects of the bloom, had intended him to see. He traced the encrypted directive's source code not to the non-existent office, but to a single human. An archivist named Lynn Mercer, who had been employed by the coalition for 157 years, the latest in an unbroken chain of Mercers stretching back to the first contact delegation. Her personnel file was immaculate, her performance reviews exemplary, but attached to her psych profile was a sealed annotation that the system had automatically classified under internal divergence. Lynn Mercer had, 30 years ago, begun expressing doubts. Private logs, therapy transcripts, a single encrypted message to an anonymous ethics board that no longer existed. She believed the bloom was a mistake. She had been gathering evidence for a controlled revelation, one that would force the coalition to see the architecture without triggering the failsafe. She was not trying to destroy the bloom. She was trying to make it a choice. The first revelation hit Voss like a gravity shift. The humans were not unified. The gentle, patient plan had fractured. There were those who believed in the original vision, and there were those, like Lynn, who had come to see it as a violation so profound that even the threat of galactic amnesia was preferable to a future built on invisible manipulation. And she was not alone. There were others, a quiet splinter faction, who had been slowly working to create a window, a single moment when the architecture could be seen by everyone, without triggering the dead man's switch. Her message to the non-existent ethics board had been the blueprint, and Voss realized with a cold certainty that his own investigation had just become their weapon. Lynn had planned for him. She had known his security sweep would reach her eventually. She had left a trail not too obvious, not too hidden, designed to be found by someone with the right clearance, the right paranoia, the right moral weight. The message, the seed, is ready. Await the bloom had been placed in the audit by her faction, not the original architects. It was a lure, a test, and an invitation. The bloom was already self-sustaining, yes, but the final integration required a conscious ratification by a non-human who had walked the full path of discovery and still chosen to accept it. That was the failsafe's true nature. Not a lobotomy, a judgment. The humans had built a system that required an alien to say yes, fully informed, or else everything would reset. And Lynn had just handed Voss the power to say no. But it gets even bigger. Voss traced the origin of the original cognitive architecture beyond the humans. The seed wasn't human-made. The humans had discovered it. Buried in the Coalition's deepest archive was a sealed vault, accessed only by a human curator who had died 4 generations ago, containing a data cache from a precursor species called the Architects. The Architects had seeded the galaxy with the framework for a unified consciousness millions of years before any current species had evolved. They had predicted that intelligence, left alone, would fragment into competing tribes and eventually self-destruct. Their solution was a cognitive immune system that would spread through bureaucracy, the only structure that all civilizations inevitably adopt. The humans had merely become the willing carriers of the meme. They were not the architects of the bloom. They were its gardeners, and the bloom was not a human plan. It was a galactic immune response. Now Voss understood the true scale of the stakes. The failsafe Lynn wanted to trigger wasn't just a reset of human influence. It would sever the galaxy from the architect's immune system, leaving every species exposed to their own baser instincts of tribalism and war. The peace the Coalition had enjoyed for 800 years, the peace humanity had so painstakingly preserved, was not natural. It was a carefully maintained equilibrium, now dependent on the bloom's completion. Lynn's faction believed that forced unity was tyranny, that the galaxy deserved the right to fail on its own terms. But they had not factored in the possibility that the architect's failsafe was not a choice between order and chaos. It was a choice between managed evolution and an extinction event. Voss's console chimed again. This time, it was Lynn herself, a live feed. Her face, lined with 157 years of guilt, appeared in his secure channel. She said, "You see it now. I didn't want you to be our weapon. I wanted you to be our last appeal. The original bloom was meant to be hidden forever. I can't accept that. I can't let my species decide the fate of a galaxy without anyone ever looking us in the eye and saying it's okay. So I'm asking you, Chief Voss, with full knowledge, do we let the garden grow? Or do we tear it down and hope something better rises from the rubble? You're the only non-human who has ever seen all the pieces. The architects designed the bloom to require a ward, a witness. You are that witness. Your next word will be heard by every node in the cognitive network, every human, every system. The whole galaxy is about to learn the truth, one way or another. So I ask you, what do you choose? The galaxy held its breath, and Kale Voss opened his mouth to speak. Kale Voss did not say yes, and he did not say no. He said something that no one, not Lynn Mercer, not the human architects, not the long-dead precursors, had ever predicted. He said, "What if the garden wants to know it's a garden?" The live feed expanded. Lynn's face registered shock, then something deeper, recognition. The cognitive architecture, billions of lines of unseen code woven into every layer of coalition governance, paused. Not stopped, paused, as if listening. Because the architects had not designed a dead man's switch that simply destroyed or preserved. They had designed a third option. It had always existed, buried so deep that only a witness who understood both the bloom and the failsafe, and who refused to choose violence of either kind, could speak it into being. Voss had just activated the protocol that no one knew was there, the disambiguation. The bloom would not complete in secret. The failsafe would not purge the archives. Instead, every sentient being in the coalition would receive, in their own language, a full download, the truth of the architects, the 300-year human stewardship. The decision now before them: accept the unified consciousness, reject it, or renegotiate its terms. The galaxy would become the witness, not a silent recipient of invisible influence, but a participant in its own future. The download took 11 seconds. 11 seconds in which every comms panel, every neural link, every public broadcast, every implant on a trillion worlds populated by 80,000 species went silent, then lit up with the same single document: the history of the cognitive immune system, its successes, its risks, the role humanity had played not as conquerors, but as the immune system's soft tissue, the quiet administrators who had kept the peace long enough for this moment to arrive. There was no coercion in the message, only an invitation and a deadline. The coalition had 48 hours to make a choice. Silence would default to acceptance. Active rejection would trigger a graceful disassembly of the architecture, leaving each species to manage its own cognition independently, for better or worse. The immediate response was chaos. Governments reeled. Delegates screamed. Philosopher kings debated in chambers that had never before been forced to confront their own ignorance. But something else happened too. Across the galaxy, ordinary citizens, the shopkeepers, the data clerks, the freight pilots, the parents, read the download. And they understood it. Not because it was simple, but because it was honest. The humans had not lied. They had not manipulated outcomes. They had shaped the architecture of information to favor stability, but they had done so in the open, hidden only by the galaxy's own indifference to its own bureaucratic foundations. The download exposed the most uncomfortable truth of all. For 300 years, no one had bothered to look. The humans had been visible. The galaxy had simply chosen not to see. At the 47th hour, the coalition-wide vote concluded. The silent majority, the ones who had never held power but had lived under the quiet umbrella of the architecture, spoke. 63% voted to accept the bloom, but with an amendment: full transparency, permanent audit, rotating non-human oversight councils drawn from every member species. The billions of humans who had served as invisible scaffolding would step into the light, not as rulers but as partners. The unified administration would proceed, but it would be a conscious collaboration, not an inherited automation. Lynn Mercer's face reappeared on Voss's channel 49 hours after the download began. She was calm for the first time in 30 years. She said, "We thought we were the gardeners. We were wrong. We were the seeds. The bloom was never about control. It was about this, a galaxy that could look at its own foundations and decide together what to build on top of them. We needed you to ask the question, because a garden that doesn't know it's a garden can never choose to grow." Voss, his 4 amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of his console, replied simply, "Then we're no longer a garden, we're a forest, and forests know how to spread." Somewhere deep in the coalition's root code, a previously dormant subroutine activated, and a single line of text, the last gift of the architects, appeared in every human archive. Thank you for remembering what we could not. The immune system is now the circulatory system. Spread. The quiet people had finished their work, and the galaxy, for the first time in millions of years, had been given the chance to heal itself, fully awake. The quiet people never sought recognition. They never asked for seats at the visible table. They understood something that empires, generals, and kings have always forgotten: that power doesn't shout. It files. It schedules. It remembers what everyone else forgets. The humans who spent 3 centuries inside the coalition's government were not spies, not soldiers, not revolutionaries. They were the people who showed up, did the work, and made sure that when the galaxy finally woke up, there was something worth waking up to. The story doesn't end with the vote. It never does. The bloom is now public, the immune system visible, and every species must decide daily whether to honor the architecture or dismantle it. The humans remain where they've always been, in the archives, in the committees, in the quiet rooms where decisions are prepared long before they're made. The difference now is that we know they're there. We know the names. We can ask the questions. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you could quietly shape the world from behind a desk, would you? And if someone already was, would you thank them or would you fear them? Because the truth is, every civilization has quiet people. The only thing that changes is whether they're working for us, or whether we've simply never thought to look. If you want more stories that explore the hidden architecture of power, subscribe now and turn on notifications. We release new deep dive documentaries every week. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.